The title of this talk-ish is For He Himself Has Said It. I was going to play you the Doily Cart Company singing HMS Pinafore, from which one of the songs in HMS Pinafore, from which that line comes. But I can't. So now you have to listen to me sing. No. But you probably know the song, you probably heard the song, For He Himself Has Said It. You know that one? Yeah. He is an Englishman, he is all that stuff. So the key point being in the song is, it could have been a Russian, or a Frenchman, or an Italian. He had the jolly good taste of being born English, this character. And what was interesting was the line, For He Himself Has Said It. He avers that he is an Englishman. He says that he is an Englishman. And the current climate, I think very few of us would go around stating that at the top of our voices anyway. I had quite a nice film I could have shown you with the HMS Pinafore singing, going on with pictures of various English buffoons who are currently plaguing our politics, including Mr. Farage and Mr. Johnson, etc. But I'm not English, I'm Scottish. And one of the most important things that Scots do is we don't throw the baby out with bathwater. Actually, we use the bathwater for making more whiskey, actually. But we try not to waste anything. And my project, I just finished one project, and this isn't really a talk about the subject matter that you've got in the program. I'm just starting to think about this. I've been doing some research on Englishness, what it means to be English, what it means to be an English male, and probably there's a kind of a subcurrent on that, being white English, probably working class or lower middle class and working class male, and what that culture has meant in the 20th century, and what it maybe means now. So that's really the kind of area I'm interested in throwing out a few kind of ideas about, some thoughts about. So let's treat this as quite informal, since I've got technical problems, and as I say, and then I can't get it back. And as I say, I'm exploring some of these ideas, so I'd love to hear things from you about it as well. Okay. And also, I'm afraid I have to read things off the screen because I couldn't project them. Don't worry, I can read. I think. So I'm going back to that line, For He Himself Has Said It. I want to start off by contending that there are two possibilities for a valid identity to exist. The first one being that an identity that's imposed upon an individual or group, but is accepted by them, and therefore is valid by that person or by that group. An imposed identity accepted by the group, by whom it's imposed. And I mean the word imposed not in a necessarily kind of brutal or violent way, but in even the most gentle way. And on the other hand, there's another kind of identity which is invented by the individual or group themselves and accepted by, I have to use the word the phrase la vie commune. So in English, I don't think we've got the word that corresponds exactly to that idea. But it's accepted by the community, if you like, in which that individual or group exists. And I think every other form of identity is invalid. If I didn't make it myself, I don't subscribe to it, unless if somebody else made that, I can agree with it. And that had to do with ideas to do with tradition, obviously family and those kinds of things. So that's my first argument, and I want to have that on the screen so it's clear, but does everybody get what I'm trying to say there? So with regards to identity, which is the main term of reference for the use for this conference, there are the program noted there are tensions that could arise between assignment and conscious identification. In any situation where identity is in question, such tensions are clearly illustrated for a poetry reader, say, by Elizabeth Bishop's refusal to allow her work to be published in a woman-only anthology, even although a woman poets anthology, even although Elizabeth Bishop was a woman and a poet, she didn't want to be identified as a woman poet. In the context of that time, in that particular anthology, I felt the same way when I first started writing poetry. I was identified as a nature poet. And I wrote about, natural things. But I knew what a nature poet meant to the person describing me as a nature poet. I didn't want any part of that. So we have that problem that I might be happy with that identity until somebody else starts using it. Elizabeth Bishop, I'm sure, was very happy being a woman and a poet. But when someone called her a woman poet, it's a different thing. I felt that as writing as a nature poet, I wasn't writing about nature. In fact, I don't think poets write about anything in that way. And that's one of the things that came. Whenever a strand of art or poetry, say, has a political significance of any kind, it starts being about something. That's what my book, which comes out in October, is all about, really. That it's not about, you see what I mean? In short, the obvious question here is, how wide is the gap between the way one person identifies him or herself as X or Y, and the way X and Y are seen by others? I need hardly point out that we live in an age when this issue is not only to the fore, but is also more perniciously and persistently perverted than at any time in living memory. Think of, for example, of terms like intellectual as generally used, mainstream. Think of the current portrayal of fathers in TV advertising. As a father myself, I almost get sick every time I actually accidentally see an advert. Have you ever seen these buffoon fathers who can't open a tin or something? The children have to help them because mum's away. No, really. It's become a cause in Britain. Think of words that not only in the United States, it used to be in the United States only, but now everywhere, words like liberal, Marxist, or socialist, various other terms. They were denigrated for political reasons in the United States. Now it's become widespread. Back there's a bar somewhere in Melbourne, you can still walk in and call yourself Marxist and get a drink. When I talk to my teenage sons and listen for the anxiety and subdued anger in their voices when we discuss a term like toxic masculinity, how it gets into the conversation, this concept of toxic masculinity, very disturbing for a 14-year-old who lives at home completely alone, plays guitar, has no kind of masculine self-image that corresponds to the one that's currently in the press. But then as soon as he leaves the house, it's described as toxic. Growing up as a Scotsman in Northamptonshire, by the way, I know all about this because when we Scots left our little enclave in Corby and went 2 miles out and went to a bar, they immediately barred us. So we don't want you here. Your kind aren't welcome here. So I've never been here before. What did I do wrong? You're Scottish. Get out. And that was true. So we were very toxic too. With Brexit, though, a new group has emerged, a group ripe for vilification. To date, the term that's used is chav, which is not a perfect label, but it's the label that's being used. This group consists of English men and divides into two subcategories: cunning manipulators like Boris Johnson, Nigel Farage, and their entourages, who deceive people into voting leave, and the lower middle class working class white men who stupidly followed their lead and brought about what was, under the conditions in which it was presented to the British public, an unthinkable outcome. And I, like Alan was saying yesterday, I'm not particularly interested in the EU as an economic entity or anything to do with trade. Trade doesn't affect me particularly. I haven't got any stocks and shares, I'm poor. But the dream of peace, which is what the EU was about, certainly for people like me, that's what mattered. The idea that if we were all in the same gang, as it were, we wouldn't fight them. We wouldn't declare war on each other all the time. So how did this happen? And what happened to Englishness in the years leading up to Brexit? And that's my concern that I'll be hopefully writing about in this book. For those concerned not to throw out the baby with the bathwater, could it be bathwater? Could it be that some kind of Englishness that's been lost is worth keeping, or worthwhile? As you can see, I am not identifying today as an Englishman. I'm identifying as a Singaporean, wearing a shirt that I bought on Arab Street in Singapore. And right now, I'd really rather be a Singaporean than anything else. There's rather such an elegance and charm and peacefulness about many Singaporean men. Although maybe their families wouldn't agree. And so I'm not English, and I can't identify myself as English. I was born in Scotland, and I moved to Northamptonshire at the age of 11. I lived for the rest of my formative years in a steelmaking town to which so many Glaswegians and other Scots had migrated. It was called Little Scotland. In 1965, when I arrived, to stand in the middle of the industrial new town in a thick fog of ferrous pollution, loomed over by the Corby Candle, which was a huge tower with a towering chimney which burned off waste gas. Could have been standing anywhere in industrial Scotland, in the industrial heartland of Scotland. But you cycle 5 miles out of there and you're in rural England. And I mean really, Aikenfield, England, green England, little grey, cottages and all that kind of England. Saxon churches. Desire past it. Maybe John Clare once wandered. As an irascible and solitary teenager, and toxic as hell as I am, I spent my life exploring this landscape, returning on my bike again and again to the Triangular Lodge, beautiful building on the grounds of an estate which was built. Everything was in threes to express, the faith in the Trinity. Or the village of Rockingham, taking the bus down through deep lanes and dappled copses to Great Oakley, or to the Alfred East Gallery in Kettering, where I fell in love with a particularly English form of exoticism. But if ever in Kettering, even the name itself doesn't sound particularly hospitable, does it? There's a nice little gallery dedicated to Alfred East's work. After I got a part-time job, my record collection expanded to include work by Benjamin Britten and Vaughan Williams, and particularly Michael Tippett. From that dream of Northamptonshire, I accidentally really moved on to a dream of Cambridgeshire, of Cambridge and its surroundings, of Ely, the Fens, that's done in Suffolk coast, and pretty soon I was a devotee of a very specific land-based, highly interpreted Englishness. An Englishness that, as I say, I had no right to claim. And I would have had little, for a while at least, to argue with when reading John of Gaunt's description of my new homeland in Richard II. This other Eden, demi-paradise, this fortress built of nature for herself against infection and the hand of war, this happy breed of men, sorry about this language, this little world, this precious stone set in the silver sea, this blessed plot, this earth, this realm, this England. I'm sure all the actors in the room are wincing. Luckily, I've got my reading glasses on, so I can't see that. But anyway, there's John of Gaunt mould for you. But the idea that if this country is so beautiful, is it really something that follows that the happy breed of people who live there somehow may then acquire or develop values that respond to the land, respond to the places into which they were born? And if so, what were those values? I wanted to know that. Because my values weren't. My values were based on violence, essentially. And working class Scots, males, were basically very simple. If somebody annoyed you enough, you hit them. Or if you annoyed somebody, they hit you. If you felt strong enough, you hit back. That was it. So Englishness presents something else which seems very much more elegant than that. Not that very much else could be less elegant, but so that I knew that England was saddled with a class system which was appallingly unjust, not just to people like Scots, Welsh, and Irish, but also to most English people. I knew all about that. I'm not being naive. I didn't go out kind of looking for this Aikenfield dream and believe it was just there. But I thought, using one's imagination can draw something out of it. When I lived in Cambridge, I used to go to the Scott Institute all the time, and here's where you don't see the film, so you have to use your imaginations by listening to the soundtrack, I think. Excuse me a moment. I used to go to the Scott Institute, and I loved reading the diaries and letters and the various things to do with the doomed Antarctic expedition. And of course, many of you will know about Captain Oates. Sorry you can't see this, but...
On the 17th of March 1912, Captain Oates walked out of a tent in Antarctica and into history. His calm, almost self-mocking last words, "I'm just going outside and maybe some time," made him a hero and ensured that the whole world became involved in the drama of the Scott expedition to the Antarctic. There was no hint of such drama in the early life of Lawrence Oates. Born in 1880 in Putney, southwest London, to wealthy parents, Oates was a sickly youth. But his mother, the formidable Caroline Oates, doted on her firstborn son.
Let's go and jump a bit now.
On the 1st of November, when daylight had returned, the team set off for the pole. In a letter to Oates' mother, Scott described him as one of the most popular and cheery members of our small community. As they travelled to the Beardmore Glacier, pony after pony died. On the 9th of December, at the foot of the glacier, the last pony was shot. Now the team would rely on human muscle for the 125 miles as they climbed 10,000 feet up the glacier, and then on for another 350 miles to the South Pole. On January the 3rd, as the team approached the top of the Beardmore Glacier, Scott selected the final team to go to the pole. Oates was included. He wrote home to his mother, "What a lot we shall have to talk about when I get back. God bless you and keep you well until I come home." The 18th of January 1912, the polar team, Scott, Oates, Evans, Bowers and Wilson, reached the pole, only to find that Amundsen had beaten them to it. "Great God, this is an awful place," was Scott's comment. Oates was characteristically cool. "Scott is taking his defeat much better than I expected." As the team turned for home, the weather worsened and their physical condition deteriorated, with frostbite common and food short. On the 17th of February, Evans died. By now, the exhausted team was managing only a few miles a day, while the weather got worse, with temperatures regularly below minus 40 degrees. Oates' feet were now a major problem. On the 4th of March, Scott noted in his diary, "The poor soldier is nearly done. It is pathetic enough because we could do nothing for him." 10 days later, Scott saw that Oates had had enough. At night, we knew the end had come. He was a brave soul. He slept through the night before last, hoping not to wake, but he woke in the morning yesterday. It was blowing a blizzard. He said, "I'm just going outside and maybe some time." He went into the blizzard, and we have not seen him since. The 17th of March 1912, his 32nd birthday, Oates walked out of the tent to his death so that his friends might have a chance to live. But it was a sacrifice in vain. 2 weeks later, Scott, Bowers and Wilson froze to death in their tent. For Caroline Oates, none of the hundreds of letters she received was more poignant than that from Dr. Wilson, who died himself just a few days after Oates. "I've never seen or heard of such courage," he wrote. "Never a word or a sign of complaint of the pain. He was a great example." Among the numerous tributes to Oates, none perhaps was nearer the mark than the Belgium newspaper, Le Temps. When the question is asked, what is a true gentleman, it will suffice to say that it is a man who behaves like Captain Oates.
So, impressionable as I was, I kind of developed this sort of hero thing for Oates. And there's those qualities, this self-sacrifice, which is based on reason. It wasn't just some kind of beau geste of a kind of romantic nature. It was based on logic. If he left, he was suffering. He wasn't going to make it. If he left, maybe some of the others would get back. And also reading Scott. I mean, Scott's been denigrated by all kinds of people in all kinds of ways. As a bad commander, he wasn't in the Navy, so why should he be in that expedition? And not caring enough about his men. There's a really nice film about that, Ranulph Fiennes being talking about this. But the truth is quite opposite in terms of caring about his men. The last things that Scott wrote in his diary were exactly about that point. This is the last entry in Scott's diary. Since the 21st, we've had continuous gales from west, southwest, and southwest. We had fuel to make 2 cups of tea apiece, and bare food for 2 days on the 20th. Every day we have been ready to start for our depot, 11 miles away. But outside the door of the tent remains a scene of whirling drift. I do not think we can hope for any better things now. We shall stick it out to the end. But we are getting weaker, of course, and the end cannot be far. It seems a pity, but I do not think I can write more. R. Scott. And then sometime later, but not much later, he must have written this. For God's sake, look after our people. And Scott himself his family would have been fine, but he was very concerned about the men in the party and their families. So, and one possible image of Englishness, which is not beyond interpretation and criticism, but nevertheless, it isn't entirely tainted either. Another example, which will probably be mysterious to many people here, is I was lucky enough when I was quite young to meet the cricket commentator John Arlott. Straw pulled. Has anybody ever heard of John Arlott? Yeah. A few people. John Arlott was the voice of English cricket, and he talked like that, and a Hampshire accent, and really rich, light, lush voice. So it was instantly recognised on the radio, you know. So you knew the cricket was on as soon as you heard John Arlott's voice. And I was a big fan of his, and I got to meet him, and I was just thrilled. He also was the wine writer for the Guardian and Observer, and he was very good. But anyway, just out of college, I met him. His way at the microphone was legendary. I've got a couple of quotes here. He once described Australian tail-ender Ernie Toshak's batting style as being like an old lady poking her umbrella at a wasp's nest, while Keith Miller, one of the finest all-rounders in cricket history, was brilliantly characterised as a cross between a Viking and an irresponsible schoolboy. It's rare that sports commentators have the kind of poet's gift. John Arlott was himself a poet and didn't write a lot, but he wrote some, and he was a very close friend of Dylan Thomas's. And he had the sharp eye of Hogarth. He was a canny, observant commentator. He wasn't only that; he was also, as I said, a fine wine writer. He described wine as a successful effort to translate the perishable into the permanent. It's pretty good. And he was also an effective, for his time, an effective campaigner against apartheid. And very early on in his career, he was sent to South Africa to comment on an England-South Africa game. And he refused to continue and came back and spent the rest of his career standing up against apartheid in various ways. And I mean, that could have finished him, and he was brave to do it. He was described after he died by Gillian Reynolds in The Telegraph in words that obviously I haven't handpicked these at all. He was revered for his independence, his Englishness, his sense of fairness and justice, a sympathy for the underdog, and relish for the beautiful and the good. And I think if I would aspire to anything, those words would be rather a good description. And I am thinking here about identity as an aspiration. You know, I'm sure John Arlott had faults like everyone else, and I'm sure that Captain Oates was just a regular guy who did some one brave thing, maybe, but it's something to aspire to. This idea, it seems to me, these are virtues of responsible, by no means all of the virtues of responsible masculinity that one could think of as being worth attaining. that idea of fairness and justice, the greater good, the beautiful wherever it might be found, from a great graceful catch in the slips to the fantasia chanting the theme of Thomas Tallis. Add to this from Scott's party camaraderie in difficulty, and the sense that an honourable pursuit is more important than merely winning. I think that's the thing that bothers me most in the society I live in now, is winning is everything. And this comes from the United States culture, right, mostly. I was brought up to think that if you played the game well, that's what really mattered. If you played well, it didn't matter if you won. I mean, I am Scottish, so every time Scotland played England in football, we lost, except for once, when we beat them 5-0, just after they won the World Cup, and so we decided we had won the World Cup. But other than that, I had to accept defeat gracefully quite a lot, and also be an English cricket fan until quite recently. Also, a similar predicament arose. But I think, I'm not just joking about that, I think that's an important thing to have, quality to have, to be able to say, the game is much more important than me, than my desires, than me winning, than me being successful in those ways. And I think that myth or that idea of Englishness included this idea of the game being so important. I want to summarize these aspirations as a kind of lifelong openness grace, which leaves it open the question of what we mean by grace. And my working answer right now is grace is the bodily knowledge that God, and St. Paul's terms, God is no respecter of persons. You prefer to use other terms, but I use the term God or the game, is no respecter of persons. It doesn't matter what I want, you want, etc. The game is more important. The game is larger than us all. And our only obligation is to play it to the full, at whatever it costs to our personal interests. The game, of course, is cricket. No, it's not just cricket. But, it's cricket and baseball and creature game. Sport is useful from that point of view. You look at what people do on the field, and it says everything about character. Something to aspire to, with the acceptance that failure is not only possible, almost certain, inevitable. Everything that's worth doing, I think, is you have to accept from the beginning that failure is built in. If you start writing poetry, age, 16, you'll know that one day you come to the age of, are we 29? Yeah. To the ripe old age of 29, that you're going to have to sit back and say, nah, I failed, but I failed honorably. The good things that are worth doing are things that you're probably going to fail at, but hopefully failing in an interesting way. I was never interested in worldly success. I know that's typical, but that's probably why these things attract me, because they're about some pleasure. They're about something else. They're about something that's more valuable, and grace is of the essence of that. So, bringing us back to Brexit, as I said at the beginning, these are just introductory or exploratory remarks to think about what's happening now with Brexit. I remember when I started work, I worked for about 10 years, I guess you'd call it commerce. I was a computer systems designer, and I worked for businesses and things. And I remember the language that was being used then, and it seemed to me relatively new in the 80s, 90s. Terms like dog eat dog, that kind of everyone for themselves, and that kind of mentality that seemed to kind of permeate not only business but society generally. And then the 80s gave that to us. And I started trying to think about, historically, where do you begin talking about that? And I started using the word Thatcherism. And then I thought, that's the laziest thing I've done in a long time, which is saying a lot. Thatcherism is a lazy term. What does Thatcherism even mean? What did Margaret Thatcher do? Were there any ideas in Thatcherism that weren't taken from Reaganomics? No, not really. And then I thought, the real term is Churchillism. Churchillism. Let's bear with it, how awful that sounds for a minute, and say, what's the great kind of heroic figure of this kind of, ugliness? But Winston Churchill, Margaret Thatcher adored him. Boris Johnson wrote his biography. Donald Trump, when Donald Trump came to the White House, the first thing he did was to go into But go to where Barack Obama had taken Winston Churchill's bust out and put in Martin Luther King and swapped them back round again. So that Churchill was back in this place, prominent place. Winston Churchill believed in eugenics. He sent British troops in to attack the Welsh miners in 1910. He talked about brown-skinned people being inferior to. He had no regrets that superior people would go to places where there were brown-skinned people and take over and run their lives for them. This is the kind of thing he was saying. He wrote a letter to Mussolini saying, "If only I was Italian, I could be working with you now." This is in the 20s. I'll be standing by you now. This is what Winston Churchill means, if you read the history. And yet, in 2012, Winston Churchill was voted the greatest British person ever to live. Greatest ever to live. I mean, okay, it was drawn from a list that you couldn't just choose anybody, because obviously it doesn't work that way. But that list included Shakespeare. I think even had a woman on it. I think it was Jane Austen. But you know, Isambard Kingdom Brunel came second, I think. Shakespeare was like number 5. Yeah? But Winston Churchill was number 1. And he won by a resounding victory. So this was a mood that was beginning to happen in about 2012. You know, I'm trying to put us back 100 years, 1912. This mood was beginning to kind of gather power, you know, that Winston Churchill represented a kind of greatness. And it's just not true. So, I want to conclude, for a model of masculine English, we'll leave the class bit out of it for a moment, a hero, if you like, or an exemplar, I want to choose someone beyond Oates and select John Donne. John Donne, who says, "No man is an island." We all know the first part. No man is an island. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Somebody finish it? Any finish it? No man is an island and tyrant to himself.
Part of the me.
Close, yeah. Yeah. Oh, no man is an island and tyrant to himself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. If a clod be thrown away by the sea, Europe is the less. The less. I mean, obviously, Europe is, in this case, I mean, it's kind of apropos, obviously, with Brexit. But this is the kind of vision that John Donne had. No man is an island, or as the Jefferson Airplane once commented on that line, he's a peninsula. But no man is an island. And he was talking, at that point, he was talking about somebody who had died. I mean, it was a narration for, you know, when a man, in this case, for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for you, etc. So, but if you read John Donne's work, his compassion for others extends way beyond funeral orations, even down to the level of insects and other creatures. I have to keep retyping my password every 2 seconds because this is the University of St Andrews a machine. And to finish, two quotes from somebody who's, as it were, theoretically backs up the kind of vision that I find in John Donne, a woman called Lois Shepherd, who's an American lawyer, legislator, who writes about, mostly to do with medical issues, medical arguments, etc. And she proposes, coming out of the work of Levinas, she's very influenced by Levinas, she proposes an idea called radical responsibility, which I think, if one reads people like Donne, and one thinks about the best parts of that kind of English fantasy of masculinity, radical responsibility seems to me to fit in. And I just want to read a couple of, as I say, I was going to project these, but we are either terribly naive or worse, unthinkingly presumptuous if we think that we know how the other person feels, or that we even transitorily or vicariously experience or share in the suffering of the other person. Too often what seems like sharing is actually presuming that we can know what another experiences when we are not that person, and when we may never have experienced anything similar. And she goes on to say, if we look no further than compassion to determine our duties to one another, then we seek no more than contract. We assume that everyone is equal and has the equal ability to enter into contracts for his benefit, excuse the language. No one has a greater claim. No one has a greater responsibility. By contrast, an ethics of radical responsibility means that whether or not I feel compassion for the other person, I have a responsibility for another's suffering. Responsibility does not have the voluntary nature of compassion. I think it's a really powerful statement, and obviously one could argue it's not new, it's a rephrasing of something that exists in people like Levinas. But I would argue that there was, for some brief period, in certain sectors of Englishness, that vision was part of the vision of a decent human male. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, that was really interesting. I sort of just wanted to go back to the very, very beginning, when you were talking about the definitions of a valid identity. And the second one specifically, about an identity that's invented by the group and then accepted by a community.
Or by the individual, whichever. Yeah.
Yes. And so I just sort of wanted to question that a little bit. Maybe you were sort of going through it quite quickly for time. But I wonder, to me it feels like if an identity is invented by a group or by an individual, there might be several situations in which the wider community doesn't accept that, or it takes time for that to be accepted. And to me that still feels like a very valid identity and one that will be accepted in the future. And so I wondered if that sort of acceptance you were talking about just a positive acceptance, or I think there are instances in which a community can say, yeah, we accept that that's your identity and that's bad. And sort of kind of how do you square that with that kind of second definition of identity?
It's obviously more complicated. I mean, I was trying to put it in relatively kind of equation-like form, as it were. But I do think that, I mean, the question of the validity is quite important. If there's no agreement between this group and the La Vie Commune, which is what I was trying to suggest, not necessarily just people around you, but the idea of a working community in which the individual group existed, and then that community itself had its own values, etc. I think that there could be the existence of an identity which isn't valid in the same way for all of the parties, i.e. the members of the group and most of outside it, isn't valid in the same way as other identities are. As you say, maybe over time that can be made to change. And of course it can go both ways. I mean, most people who call themselves, for example, socialists, say now wouldn't feel very comfortable with the way socialists are described in most mainstream media, for example, especially in the United States. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, obviously it's a little crude, I think, or maybe it's more than a little crude. But I do think there's an important question about whether or not, I'm Scottish, and if I said, I like this idea of Englishness so much, I want to be English, I can't just describe myself as English. I mean, somebody who is born in England turns around and says, but you're not English, I don't care if you like cricket or not, you're still not English. But, is that necessarily the case? I'm not sure. But if the invention is done well enough, and what's the right word, with enough integrity, I think then eventually the greater community would be bound to either accept it or purge it. Of course, there's the other thing you do with identity you don't like.
I suppose then, I'll go for you. I'll hand it over. I guess maybe it's a difference in terms of the word valid, and also the difference maybe between an identity that is chosen, so a Scotsman moving to England and feeling English, and an identity that you're born with or that you grow up with, that is maybe invented, in inverted commas, by you or your community, but is also integral to you and not something that you can divorce yourself from. And to me, that sense of identity would be valid even if the community that is within doesn't accept it. So I suppose maybe that's two different.
Yeah.
Or maybe the word valid is one that
Maybe a
doesn't
strong word.
encompass that.
Yeah. I think I'm not alone in this group, a group like this, and feeling that most of my life, I've gone through most of my life, having identities imposed upon me from the outside, which I didn't agree with. You know, oh, you're a working class Scot. Everyone run like hell, because it's going to attack you and mug you and steal your whiskey. You know, a male. Most constructions of maleness that I see, I don't see myself in them. Any kind of a national identity I feel uncomfortable with in the end. But I can feel an allegiance with this kind of Englishness. But it doesn't mean I feel less Scots in other ways. You know, and obviously I can't choose everything about my identity. But I can say that I do reject somebody else imposing upon me their idea of what an identity. Maybe the label we agree upon is that they have a different view of what that label means. But thanks, I'm still working on this. So I think that you're right, the word invalid is perhaps too strong. Maybe it's more refinement too.
Thanks so much for this talk, which I found very provocative. I have a sort of question or maybe just a comment for you and the group. I think coming here, I didn't realize actually how many people from the UK would be here, and I'm from New York, and that's where I live. But as everyone, especially now, as you were speaking, I kept thinking about. I know this was supposed to be sort of from 1945 to Brexit, but it seems like the English, like the history of basically the English Civil War is just so alive or should be maybe, in our discussions of, I mean, all the language that you're using about kind of like Republican language, like small r, Republican, of, virtue and integrity and character and exemplary life, these are very old values and ideas that like the levelers and the diggers were fighting for, people who we don't hear about now, certainly not in the States. I don't know if, I don't know what British education is like, but it would seem that those models, like of Winstanley or, these people are good examples to look to, and to me that seems like such a part of the misfortune. I don't want tragedy is maybe big, but just of what's going on now is that you have this history of fighting for exactly what you're talking about, of the greater good and identifying perhaps in a bodily or like earthly way with what is common, and it seems so intuitive that this should be all of ours and divided equally, and but already there's been sort of like socialism is like a silly idea that of our youth, or the idea of trying to get everybody an equal share is kind of naive, or so I wonder about that. That's sort of, I'm just putting that out for everybody as like, is this a discourse that we can look to for guidance? Is there something that we can learn from that? And is it something that you've thought about?
I'll be brief because it's a big thing. But I very much agree with Paul Kingsnorth, English writer Paul Kingsnorth, who said that probably historically the worst thing that happened to the British Isles was the invasion of the Normans in 1066. And I believe that's true for many reasons. And I believe that Paul is absolutely sincere in saying so. And he wrote a book called The Wake, and it's about Hereward, the resistance fighter, who is by no means painted in some kind of charming light, as it were. He's a pretty crude and ruthless character, as a guerrilla fighter might be. But I agree with him on that because into British life was introduced this idea of this upper level and everybody else being lower level, to the point of you know, a man went hunting for deer in the forest, he got his hand cut off, for example, for taking the king's deer, because every deer in the country belongs to the king, etc. That kind of, the Queen still owns all the swans. I deeply resent that, because I've got some good recipes for swans. But, you know, this idea was, but you can even take it back further, and then the destruction of Celtic society. And I've been doing some work on the Brehon laws, which are the laws that were in operation in Ireland before the English very systematically almost eradicated them to control land beyond the Pale. And the Brehon laws are much more just and civilized, whatever that term is, than the laws that pertained elsewhere. And they go back to Celtic legal systems that were in effect all the way from Galicia to Ireland. So you could trace it back to there, and there's lots of work being done on that. So I completely agree with you. History is a long game, isn't it? I mean, we in 2008, we reaped the consequences of the 1980s, you know, what to a large part. And people say, oh, well, you know, that's silly because it's such a long time. So it's a drop in the ocean in terms of history. Mao Zedong was asked what he thought about the French Revolution. He said, in the 60s, he was asked about it, and he said it's too soon to tell. I kind of go with that, you know, I mean, I think we should look back for that long historical arc.
Well, it's not a question, it's a recommendation.
All right.
Captain Oates, have you read The Birthday Boys by Belle Bainbridge?
No.
Which is a truly exceptional masterpiece,
All right.
which is exactly about that. And she takes each of them, I think she does it in the first person, and gives them a narrative and finds their voices. It's
Sounds great.
just astonishingly good.
Thanks.
Yeah, and very little known for some reason.
Yeah.
I've got recommendations. Have you heard of the band I Like Trains?
It's what?
A band called I Like Trains.
I have, actually, yeah.
Have you seen their animation?
Yeah.
Terranova, yeah. Oh, well, I was going to recommend it to you. I thought you'd like it.
Yeah,
if anyone doesn't know,
great.
so that all their songs are kind of about based on historical events, and this one's about expedition.
Right,
And
yeah.
a good friend of mine did the animation.
Oh, really?
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, can I get his autograph or autograph for my sons, because they're both huge
Oh,
fans?
of course, yeah. They're all fans, yeah.
They introduced me to it, in fact. All I know about contemporary culture comes from my kids. You know. But that's great, thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you, John.
Thanks.